Welcome back. Did I see you folks all a month ago? I was wondering back then what I was going to do with my Saturday evenings. I guess this is the answer. So here I am a month later with not a single French work to discuss. For those of you who weren't here a month ago, my name is Stephen Whiting. I teach musicology and history of music at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. Tonight's concert, I'm going to go through in the order in which you're going to hear things. I'm not going to confuse you with chronology because they clearly want to make a big deal of Beethoven when they arrive there. So I'll discuss the works of Sibelius, Britten, and Beethoven. Beginning with the tone poem by Sibelius, Pohjola's Daughter. There's a lot to unpack in this work. First of all, it's fair to regard it as an expression of musical nationalism. Nationalism is kind of difficult to define in all cases, but it typically entails two desires. A desire for freedom from external political domination, and a desire to promote a distinctive cultural or ethnic identity. When Sibelius wrote this tone poem in 1906, the political domination was coming from where? Russia. Finland was an autonomous grand duchy within the Russian Empire, and so it remained until it declared its independence in 1917. Before the 19th century, what had been the external political domination? Where had that come from? Sweden, exactly. And the cultural mainstream against which an ethnic Finn might want to assert some Finnish ethnic identity remained not so much Russia as Sweden. Sibelius himself grew up in a Swedish-speaking family, didn't master the Finnish language very well ever in his life, because when he was a kid, it wasn't allowed to be taught in schools. So to assert this Finnish ethnic identity, Sibelius resorted to the same tactic as did composers like Smetana and Dvorak. He drew upon subject matter from his own land and legendary. For Finns, that legendary had become available in the form of the Kalevala, a national epic compiled during the 1830s and 40s by a philologist named Elias Lönnrot. Like Smetana and Dvorak before him, Sibelius turned to the genre of the symphonic poem, a genre actually created by Franz Liszt. A symphonic poem is an orchestral work in a single movement that is inspired by something non-musical, something the composer acknowledges in the title, be it a work of literature, or a scene from nature, or a philosophical idea, or an episode from history, what have you. The symphonic poem was tailor-made for nationalistic composers who could serve up whatever slice of ethnic legendary they pleased in the form of evocative music. Sibelius's direct inspiration for this endeavor was the tone poems of Richard Strauss. You're probably familiar with Don Quixote or Death and Transfiguration or Thus Spake Zarathustra. Strauss called such works tone poems. That was the name he preferred to symphonic poem, but it means the same thing. Okay, back to Pohjola. In the Kalevala, Pohjola is the northernmost region of Finland. And in the score available to me, the following story is recounted in German poetry, which is printed opposite the first page of music. I'll paraphrase that for you. The mythic hero Wainamoinen is riding homeward on his sleigh from this northern region, described as a homeland of dark songs. The music takes its time building up this atmosphere of darkness and of a sleigh gradually picking up speed on its journey across the snow. Suddenly, Wainamoinen looks up and sees a seductive vision in the middle of the sky. It is the daughter of the north, Pohjola's daughter, spinning at her wheel. This radiant apparition is to be imagined by you the moment you hear the harp enter. Okay, when you hear the harp, look up. You'll see her right about it there somewhere, right? Wainamoinen, always on the lookout for a suitable bride hasn't found one yet, asks her to come down from the sky and join him on his sleigh. She sets a condition. Sure, but first, use your magic powers. Of course, Wainamoinen has magic powers. That's what makes him a mythic hero. Use your magic powers to turn my spindle into a boat, and I'll gladly follow you. So Wainamoinen exerts his magic powers to the utmost. You'll hear that in the music too. But he can't pull it off. He can't come up with a magic formula. Sort of like the sorcerer's apprentice in that respect. Stung to the quick by his failure, he leaps back into his sleigh and travels on. Shamefaced, but gradually he's able to hold his head up high again. All heroes must overcome their suffering. The soft tones of memory soothe pain and bring hope. Thus, the final lines of the poetic excerpt printed in the score, and thus the ending of Sibelius's symphonic fantasy. Benjamin Britten composed his violin concerto on this continent, mainly in Canada. He had left Great Britain in April 1939 for a variety of reasons, political and personal. Suffice it to say that as a pacifist and a gay man, he could see all the ways he would not fit in with British society in the inevitable war to come. He wrote this concerto during the summer and fall of 1939, when Britain also declared war on Germany. The premiere was given by the New York Philharmonic in March 1940 under the baton of John Barbaroli. The soloist was the Spanish violinist Antonio Broza. Broza and Britten were friends, and together they had given the world premiere of Britten's Suite for Violin and Piano Opus 6 at the 1936 Festival of the International Society for Contemporary Music. That festival had taken place in Barcelona shortly before the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. Britten seems to have had Broza in mind as soloist from the start as he worked on this concerto. Tonight's soloist is Augustin Hadelich, last heard in Detroit performing Beethoven's Violin Concerto. I remember that performance well because I gave a pre-concert lecture for that too. Those of you who know Beethoven's Concerto may recall that it begins with a timpani solo. Boom, 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 la, da, da. Right, okay. So too, Britten's concerto begins with a timpani solo. I don't mean to trivialize it, but only to make it memorable for you when I say that this timpani solo may remind you of the Christmas song, The Little Drummer Boy. Remember the pa-rum-pa-pum-pum motive? Pa-rum-pa-pum-pum is the motive you'll hear at the beginning of Britten, punctuated with psh, a cymbal stroke. The first movement is pretty tough technically, particularly because of its many double stops, which have the soloist playing 2 or 3 or 4 strings at once to produce chords. But when you hear the solo violin turning the timpani solo, the pa-rum-pa-pum-pum, into double stops, you'll know that the movement is coming full circle. It ends quietly, with the timpani and the cymbal back in their respective thematic roles, and the violin just sort of soaring off into the stratosphere. The second movement is the scherzo in this work. The soloist plunges in like some demented country fiddler, and the music seems to have swallowed Prokofiev pills. The central section is slower and quieter, but no less intense. This gives way, here's another thing to listen for, it's one of my favorite moments, this ungainly trio between two piccolos and a tuba. Okay? Try to suppress your snigger for that. And then we're back to the demonic country fiddler with major contributions from the timpani. It's a good night for the timpanist. The cadenza, that is the show-off passage for the soloist where the orchestra has to keep quiet, comes at the end of this movement, but it has a lot of memories of the pa-rum-pa-pum-pum motive. Okay? So you're going to hear that both plucked and bowed in double stops. And this leads straight into the finale, which is a passacaglia. So what's a passacaglia? A centuries-old way of shaping an instrumental piece by repeating a specific phrase over and over while adding and changing lots of other things. You probably know Passacaglias by J.S. Bach. That organ one, la dum dee 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 dee, et cetera, right? Britten's phrase in this Passacaglia is basically a scale that goes up in dotted rhythms and comes down in even rhythms. You'll hear that thread of continuity in every possible instrument, including the solo violin, in several different meters and in many tempos, not to mention expressive characters, running the gamut from grief to caprice. It won't always draw attention to itself, although when the trombones and tuba have it, it will be hard to miss. The ending I would characterize as an apprehensive threnody, as if in mourning for the casualties of the Civil War in Spain and in the war to come. If you've never heard this concerto before, and it certainly has not attained warhorse status, you're in for a real discovery, especially as Hadelich performs it. I was blown away last night. Beethoven's Seventh Symphony is a massive work about which I could talk, indeed have on several occasions already talked for about 2 hours straight. I'll restrict my comments to 3 aspects: the biographical context, the matter of rhythm, and the most popular movement, the allegretto. The idea of writing this symphony arose from a generous impulse on Beethoven's part. During his summer vacation of 1811, he met a gentleman who organized concerts to benefit a school run by Catholic nuns for girls from impoverished families. Beethoven, being or thinking himself flush at the time, placed many of his recent orchestral works at their service, and even promised to write a new symphony just for them, his 7th. Then another, as he went straight on to write his 8th. Then his finances turned south, and Beethoven had to resign himself to drawing his own profit from the premieres of these works. As he wrote these symphonies in the Bohemian spa town of Teplitz, Napoleon was launching his ill-fated Russian campaign of 1812. Beethoven was writing an impassioned letter to an unnamed immortal beloved, whose identity is still hotly debated by musicologists. And he was meeting the German poet Goethe for the first time, or as we call him in Chicago, Goethe. There was lots going on that summer. By the time public performances of the new symphony could be organized, Napoleon had retreated from Russia and was now facing wars of liberation on all fronts in Europe, in all the countries that he thought were conquered. In June 1813, a French army under his brother Jerome's command was defeated by the British general Wellington at Vitoria in northern Spain, prompting Beethoven's so-called Battle Symphony in a somewhat shady collaboration with the inventor of the metronome, Mälzel. October 1813 was an especially bloody month. The so-called Battle of the Nations near Leipzig pitted Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden against Napoleon, who was forced to retreat, could not surmount those odds. While retreating, he engaged a force of some 50,000 Bavarians, until recently his allies, at Hanau, near Frankfurt, and he routed them. In early December, a memorial concert was organized in Vienna for the benefit of soldiers wounded in that battle. Beethoven's Seventh was premiered at the beginning of that concert. At the end of the concert, his Battle Symphony, Wellington's Victory, closed it. Both pieces were so successful that the concert was repeated 4 days later, and then again on New Year's Eve, where Beethoven finally got a share of the profits. That performance was for his benefit. Now, what's the musical relevance of all this, you may ask? The Seventh happens to begin with the longest slow introduction Beethoven ever wrote for a symphony. This introduction previews lots of ideas that are going to turn up later in the main body of the symphony. The very first idea, bum, ba, da, dum, 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 is going to turn up later in the trio section of the allegretto. Da dum, da 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 dum. Another idea, lum, dee 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 dim dim dee dim dee dee dim, will be sped up to form the manic whirling motive of the finale. That. To paraphrase two modern commentators, it's as if the slow introduction were gathering all the forces Beethoven would need for the symphony to come. Everything set in order, poised and ready, checked, double-checked, and triple-checked before he launches the vivace. Well, think of a general marshaling his musical troops for battle. That's what Beethoven is doing. Each movement of the Seventh Symphony is governed by a distinctive rhythmic figure, repeated consistently enough to generate the energy of dance. Hence, Richard Wagner's famous description of this music as the apotheosis of the dance. In the first movement, it's the dotted rhythm pattern. That one. It raises the curtain on the vivace and figures in every salient thematic idea of the movement. In the allegretto, of course, it's the ta, 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 ta pattern. And just wait for the tempo here. He is not this. I remember here, I've heard this so often, it's kind of a dreary trudge. Dum, 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 dum. That's not going to be the way it's played tonight. In the third movement, there's an initial revving figure, that, which kickstarts a nearly relentless pelting of quarter notes. I can sing on pitch. Sometimes it's not necessary, though. The finale presents a more complex rhythmic picture. There's a peremptory call to order, rum-glump, rum-glump, which sounds like a frenzied truncation of tom-tom-tom, tom, right? And this in turn kickstarts the whirling figure that drives the refrain, as though that lovely tune from the slow introduction had spun out of control, or at least into a very high gear. I know it's impossibly anachronistic, but I can't shake the image of Beethoven setting this theme on the seat of a Harley Davidson and sending it racing toward the horizon. Many an evening in my boyhood was spent with the family gathered around the Zenith phonograph, listening to Toscanini's recordings of Beethoven in this new thing called stereophonic sound. Back then, it was the allegretto of the Seventh that bewitched me, that I wanted to hear again and again. It was no different in Beethoven's day. In all the early concerts, the allegretto had to be encored. Yes, they clapped between movements back then. It's okay, don't be ashamed if you feel excited and clap. And Beethoven, believe me, was happy to oblige this request. Imagine that happening. As you can tell from the tempo prescribed, allegretto, this is not the usual slow movement. It is a march, a fairly funereal one, taking the place of a slow movement. The first chord is a chilly A minor blast from an octet of winds, and then comes a melody that is close to being a monotone. Dum, 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 dum. Thank you for finally changing pitch. Dum, 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 dum. What follows this theme is usually described as a set of variations. But in these variations, it's actually more like a passacaglia, because the theme never changes. It's implacable. It simply rises in register, sounding an octave higher each time, while some new idea enters in the viola and first cello parts. So those are the voices that always introduce something new, and everything that you've heard before goes up an octave. The first new idea is that mournful counter melody. Lum, dum, dum, da, 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 dum, dum. Rather mournful, yes, heartbreaking, but still a welcome counterpoise to the monotony of dum, 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 right? Once it's there, the counter melody too moves up octave by octave with the theme. Meanwhile, the basses and the second cellos find a different way to paraphrase the original bass line each time. In this way, the texture swells with each variation until all the winds enter fortissimo with the theme, and the first violins present the plaintive counter melody in their highest register, also fortissimo. And at this point, the funeral cortege, if that's what it is, seems closest to us, most forceful in its lamentation. And then it moves past, trailing off into the distance. What happens next is easily understood as a trio within the march. Think of your days in high school band. Every march has a trio, right? Entailed in the structural convention of the trio, especially in a minor mode work, is the following. Well, the following bitter truth, really. Whatever expressive content the trio conveys cannot last, because the march has to return. That's the poignancy of middle sections in a musical work. They never have the last word. And so, the A major sunshine that comes with la-dum, dee, 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 and the smoothly flowing accompaniment underneath that is something of a tonal mirage, a utopian vision of what this movement cannot achieve. A prisoner's dream of liberty that vanishes once the prisoner awakens. As if to remind us of this, the pattern from the march, ta, 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 continues in the bass line nearly throughout. And when the march returns, as return it must, where do we hear the oppressive monotone theme? In the only part that has not yet presented it, the bass line, in pizzicato. Boom, boom, boom. You'll hear it right over there. And you'll think it's just a bass line at first, and then you'll realize, oh my gosh, that's the tune. Sure, the trio is revisited, but it feels DOA. And the very last chord of the movement is the very same A minor blast we heard at the beginning. Ouch. Talk about the feeling of getting nowhere. Lucky we are that there are two movements to come. Lucky we are that these movements reimpose a sense of unbridled rhythmic energy and ultimately stage a musical triumph to stand in for all the personal triumphs that may elude us in actual life. Thank you very much.